It's Black History Month, and like clockwork, book influencers are dragging out their books about race, which begs the question, why do all Black stories have to talk about race? Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. I am Aaliyah, and I'm very excited to talk about this because it feels like every February the same books are dragged out as must reads, and they all have to do with racial relations in the United States, and is always equating Blackness to race and to racial relations. And all of this just leaves like so many questions that I want to talk about in this video. One is why is it Black people's job to talk about race in the United States? Two, why do the books that we often see elevated, books by Black authors with Black stories, why do they center whiteness? And three, why do we rarely see stories centering the experiences and the lives of Black people separate from whiteness? And so to talk about all of this, I'm so excited. I finally get to talk about Elaine Castillo. I know I've mentioned her book, How to Read Now, and her essay, We Need to Reckon with the Rot at the Root of Publishing. I believe that's the title. I will put the links to both of those below. But like now we get to get into the nitty gritty, because I think that essay, even though she was mainly talking about her experiences as a Filipino living in the United States, it applies to a lot of people of color, and it does apply a lot to Black people. So in Elaine Castillo's essay, We Need to Reckon with the Rot at the Core of Publishing, which is part of her essay collection, How to Read Now, she talks about how white readers go to writers of color for gooey heart porn of the ethnographic. And so she writes, for if our stories primarily serve to educate, console, and productively scold a comfortable white readership, then those stories will have failed their readers, and those readers will have failed those stories. All the representation matters rhetoric in the world means nothing if we do not address the fundamentally fucked up relationship between writers of color and white audiences that persist in our contemporary reading culture. She then goes on to write about how the English language publishing industry leaves writers of color to be positioned along the firmly established structure as flavors of the month, as heroic saviors, as dietly important educators, as necessary interventions. Classic American story, genre, historical episode, but now populated with brown people, continues to be one of the most dominant and palatable gateways for white audiences to become accustomed to seeing Black and brown bodies on their screens and in their pages, as vessels of sensational trauma, but rarely as artists due to the same depth and breadth of critical engagement as their white colleagues, rarely as artists whose works are approached not just as sources of history or educational potential, but specific and sublime sensual immersion, sites of wonder, laughter, opulence, precision. So when we ask the question, why is it Black people's job to write about race, as Elaine Castillo writes, it is the white publishing industry that has typecasted Black people in this role. In this way, we're not getting the best of someone's work. We're not getting the wide breadth of experiences that are under Blackness, that are under a lot of different people of color. We're only getting a very narrow focus, a very narrow experience in order to push forward a narrative. And so what this gatekeeping does, it does two things, right? For readers, it teaches them that, oh, you go to writers of color when you want these things, when you want to be educated about what it's like to not be white, right? When you want to be compared and contrast to whiteness, or when you want diversity points for reading a story that could basically be a white story, but with characters of color. Those are the only two acceptable ways for a writer of color to enter into the traditional publishing industry. And then for writers of color, the story that we are taught is if we are not willing to tell those stories, our stories are not important. If we are not willing to change and shape the stories that we want to tell, those stories are not important and they're not worth being published. And so unless we're willing to cooperate, we won't be published. My argument is that it is not the responsibility of Black authors to talk about race. I talked about this in a previous video where I talked about Bacon's Rebellion and the origin of race in the United States. And race was created as a tool for capitalism. Race was created as a tool for class division. Race has been used as an act of class betrayal whereas Black people have been the victims and white people have been the perpetrators of that class betrayal. And so, in order to have racial unity, in order to have racial solidarity, it is not the responsibility of the people who have been harmed to do the work of repair, right? It is not Black people's responsibility to talk about race, to address race, to come up with solutions for how to make race better and racial relations better in the United States. We are not the ones who created the system. We are not the ones who benefit from the system. So we are not the ones who need to be coming up with solutions for how to get rid of it. It is not our job. It is not our job to talk about it. It's not our job to scold white people. It's not our job to educate. That is not our job. And I feel like we are missing out on the very best that Blackness can be and Black stories can be because the publishing industry will not allow us to tell those stories. And so you have to go to self-publishing or sometimes small presses. I've noticed small presses have really amazing books. So you have to find other avenues to get your stories out because the stories that we are allowed to tell as Black authors are so highly restricted. I think while we can talk about race, and the way that race has affected us in our stories, I think that that should be the extent of the work that we have to do as Black authors. In terms of race in writing and Black people's responsibility to educate white people, I'm not the first person to talk about this. Toni Morrison actually talked about this in 1993. I'm going to insert a clip here.
I don't want to be blanded, bleached out in order to participate in this country and walk any hall of power or corridor that I want to. If I'm not good enough, if I'm not smart enough, then that's it. The people who do this thing, who practice racism, right, are bereft. There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and a distortion. It's a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. It feels crazy. It is crazy. And it has just as much of a deleterious effect on white people and possibly equal as it does Black people. If they only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
I really love that. Leave me out of it. Leave me out of it. And so now we have to ask questions about the stories that are being elevated, right? Why are the Black stories that are elevated every single Black History Month that everyone's like, you need to read this, is so important? Why do they often center whiteness? Why aren't these Black stories that have all Black characters, that just talk about what it's like to be Black people around other Black people, that talk about our joys, our laughter, and our struggles separate from whiteness? Why can't we have that? Right? One of my favorite books is Legend Born. I really love this book, but I remember the first time I read it, I was like, this is a bunch of white people. Besides Bree and Alice, who are like two of the main characters, even though in book one, Alice was not there as much as I remember the first time I read it. She was there a lot in book two. But besides Bree and Alice, every other main character that we see, white. Her father was barely in that. And then her therapist, that section, the root working section, very small. Everybody's white. In this book with a Black main character, Black author, everybody's white. Why? I know Tracy Dion has talked about this, and she wanted to write a book that talks about what it's like to be the token Black person. And as someone who has been in that situation, that was something that I really did resonate with this book. At the same time, I was kind of over the whole, like, why is the main antagonist of a story always white supremacy? Why? And when I was reading the 1-star reviews of this book, it was the same thing. It was like, why is everybody racist? Why does y'all have to fight racism? And I know how racially charged it is to be in a predominantly white space. I know that. At the same time, it's like, bro, I'm even like that. And I love this book. This book does so many things so well. It is a book I highly recommend. But even when I recommend it to other Black people, I have to be like, there's a lot of white people There's a lot. You may not like it because there's a lot. I'm just, there's a lot. She's thirsting over every white boy she sees. It may be triggering. I just want to warn you. I do want to say that Elaine Castillo writes about this as well. So she talks about being a Filipino, and she wrote, I found that so much of our contemporary imaginings of minority lives, especially immigrant lives, always seem to posit the idea of the only Asian in the white town, the one minority, beset on all sides by white people. That narrative is often sold as the preeminent narrative of minority experience in America, and the people who sell this story often frame it as a story of typical American hardship. The difficulty of being the only Asian kid in a white class, it successfully centers whiteness in a minoritized person's story, making their narrative about adapting or not adapting to America, which is always a code for adapting to whiteness. She then goes on to critique this narrative about being about class and power, because we live in America, which is still highly segregated, even though a lot of people want to think that it's not. And so, if you are the only person of color in a room full of white people, you are there because you're upper class. You're there because you have some kind of power, you have some kind of sway in this world. That is how you are able to be in that position. And so, when we push forward narratives like this, we push forward this idea that Blackness is always struggle. Blackness is always in comparison to whiteness, and Blackness is always othered, right? There can only be one who is actually good among you. And that Black person who is the good one among you is the exception. But while we're centering stories like this, we have to think about the stories that we are excluding, right? Stories that center the working class experience. Stories that, as I said earlier, where are the stories about Black people who are in Black communities doing Black things separate from whiteness? Those stories are pushed to the side because they're seen as not important. They're seen as not having literary quality. I think about this with urban literature. I was reading this urban lit novel with my friend, and she's also Black. And I remember her laughing at it because she was laughing at the dialect that was being used. And I'm reading this. I'll admit this. I used to work as a writing educator. So I used to work to help other writers get better at their writing. And a lot of my training was not about like, you need to learn how to write in the appropriate manner. It was, you need to learn how to write in a way to express yourself that you are able to communicate to someone else in whatever way is natural and authentic to you. That is how you need to write. That is how I was taught to teach other people how to write. And so I'm reading urban literature and I'm like, this is fucking good. This is good. I'm like, look at the way these sentences are structured. Look at these ideas I read. Oh my God. Like, I'm nerding out over this and how great it is. And my friend was laughing because it was written in dialect. And I'm like, you don't even get to see like how brilliant this is because you're so caught up in this idea that literature is supposed to look one way. It's not. It's not, but these are the messages that we constantly get when we only see stories about certain types of Black experiences being told and others not. I'm not saying that writing about being the only Black person in a predominantly white space is a bad thing. That is a very valid experience. It's an experience that I've had as well, right? But I am also saying that it is a privileged experience. And as such, that privileged experience should not be centered in narratives of Blackness. And right now it is. That is what I'm saying, right? Right now, those are the books that we see being pushed over and over and over again. And rarely do we see books that are about Black experiences that most Black people have. That is how we increase literacy, right? We talk about representation all the time, but the representation is empty when the representation is just like, could be a white character, but not. Person of color, could be white, could be a white story, but not. That's not true representation. This is why we should always question about which Black stories are elevated and which ones are not. Why are the ones elevated always the ones that are about educating white people on how to be better? Why does our writing as authors of color always have to be in service to white readers? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves. As readers and writers, we have to reject this narrative that this is the only way to tell Black stories, right? As writers, I'm going to be honest with you, there are consequences for doing this, right? For me, I have seen the racial division in my reviews, and it's honestly fascinating. It's really fascinating because I can see how when I have a Black reader, I get a 4 or 5 star. When I have a white reader, I get a 1 or 2 star. And this is not unique to me. I also see it across a lot of my favorite writers as well. There was this author that I was talking to. Her name is Minda Honey. Same thing. She had 1 star reviews that was like, she talks about being a Black woman. She's a Black woman. Like a 1 star review for that. And it happens. Like whether you are, she's traditionally published, I'm not. But whether you're traditionally published or not, you are always at risk of having your stories get downvoted. You're always at risk of being told you're a bad storyteller simply for writing about an experience that is yours. But I do want to encourage writers to tell the stories that are in their hearts, tell the stories that do not center whiteness. Quit trying to think about how do I make white people better with my art. It's not about that. It's not about them. They should never be your target audience. We have centuries of literature written to white readers. They don't need us writing to them as well. But again, there will be consequences. There are a lot of traditional publishers that only want the same types of stories from Black authors. And if you're not willing to give those stories, you're going to have to go somewhere else. And a lot of us either go to small presses or we self-publish. There are repercussions for self-publishing as well. Like this morning, I just got an email from someone who had nominated my book for a state book award. And the committee came back and they rejected my book because it was self-published. Even though someone on their committee was like, oh, I really like this book. One of my favorite books of 2024. But because I'm self-published, I'm not eligible to get the award. Right? And I'm not eligible for a lot of awards. I'm not eligible for a lot of grants anymore because I wanted to publish the story the way that I wanted my stories to be published. And I did have editing help and I did have valid reviews. But none of that matters because I chose to publish the story the way that I wanted it to be published without the validation of white people. And because of that, I'm punished. So if you are a Black author who is watching this and you want your writing to be out in the world and you're not willing to cater to white readers, your work may not be well received. You may have to reimagine what your author career looks like. You may not be able to get awards and grants. These are just the ways that you are punished for not assimilating. And I think as readers, as book influencers, we have to be willing to critique books by Black authors that do not align with our Black experiences. And I'm so guilty of doing this, of not wanting to say anything bad about a Black author because I know how hard it is for Black people to get published. I know a lot of white people like to make you believe that, like, oh my gosh, they're always publishing Black people. But no, after the 2020 calls to publish more Black people, the publishing industry actually published less Black people and they published more white people in response to that. Yeah. So, no, they're not publishing. It's still extremely, incredibly hard to get published as a Black person. It's incredibly hard to get published as an author of color. It's still really hard for us. But at the same time, we have to reject these narratives that only cater to and only center one type of experience, right? We have to be willing to go outside of the zone of curation, of the things that people have told us, oh, these are what you should be reading, and be curious about what's out there. Be curious about the different types of stories that are out there and be open-minded when we come across a different type of storytelling. We have to do this work. Again, I do want to say, I don't think it's fully the fault of Black authors who are writing about race in their stories. I think it's more so the publishing industry who has chosen this role for Black authors. And we can choose not to platform these books, right? We can choose to celebrate books that align more with our experiences. We can choose differently. We can. And that's really all I have. I hope this Black History Month I see different types of books because I'm so tired of seeing the same ones. You need to learn about race, bitch. I know. I have a whole degree where I had to study racial theory and formation in the United States. I know about race. I'm tired of hearing about it, honestly. Honestly, and that's where I'm coming from. I'm honestly tired of all this. There's so much to blackness besides struggle, besides oppression, besides white people. And I really want to hear, I want to center, and I want to elevate those stories. And that's all I have. So if you like this video, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.